Good morning to one and all present here. Before we begin the event today, I would like to please invite our mentor, Dr. Sonam Mansukhani, to say a few words on today's event.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I think you all have heard more than a few words time and again. So maybe just a little more. Well, I would like to say that I always envisioned a kind of a learning hub, a space where we all could come and speak. Now, somewhere the inspiration comes in from the Greek world, because in those smaller Greek city-states, you had these thinkers like Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, and all these people, and that's kind of a space where you people used to come, discuss, and debate. So it gives me a lot of pleasure that with a lot of motivation and with a lot of support from my very dear colleagues, we instituted the Exchange, an academic platform to foster exchange of views, divergent thinking, and so on. And we've had many programs in the past wherein we have called in eminent experts from different fields, and we've also had student-related programs where students have taken the initiative. Very often the Exchange has pooled up with the different clubs, and like today, like we have pooled up with the debate club. The pooling part of it is not only about just striking a collaboration, but it is about people taking an initiative. And I'm so glad that the members of the debate club agreed, took the initiative of joining hands, and that too with full vigor. So when it was coming to the topic, I had to think of a topic which is multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary in nature. And while I was doing a little bit of research, I had to stop myself and say why to do the research, because the topic is right there in front of you. As one of our eminent guests, Dr. Manjula, has just mentioned, the fire that we are burning in, COVID-19, this is a topic which has different shades. The fact that I say socio-economic shows the blend of sociology, society, and the economic institutions. Definitely COVID-19 has had a personal impact, the informal discussion that we were just having. But if you go to see, on a more technical note, it has had impact on different sectors of the economy. As an academician, more specifically as a sociologist, and also like if I were to address the entire academic community, including you, my dear students, it's time for us, that we should wake up. We should actually start discussing not only from the sensitization point of view, which I've always been stressing on, but to question and to take further research, because designing interventions do not take place in a vacuum. Okay, designing interventions, coming up with different kinds of solutions, that is not a magical wand, that you are taking in your hand and you can come up with these things overnight. So the point is that when we are taking research on the economy, what sectors of the economy have been impacted? Okay, what is the magnitude or the gravity of the impact when it comes to the informal sector? What about the regions in which they are engulfed? The rural segment, the urban segment. I mean, I, as an academician and more specifically as a sociologist, I would be very curious to know. And it is not only about the statistical data. Please understand, these sessions go beyond the statistics, and I would like to understand, as a researcher, what would be the impact on the relationships. Say, for example, if I am a vendor on the streets and I am not getting my livelihood, there is a very strong connection between livelihood and life. What happens to my life? What happens to the life that I go back when I go back home? My interaction with my spouse, my interaction with my children. I would say this because the area in which I'm staying right now, Malleshwaram, I speak it, from a first-hand account over there, that when the college had started, I was like, I had this cab, which was bringing me to college every day. And I used to pass by these shanties where I used to see all these people out on the streets without the mask. Today, there is a lot of blame game that people are indulging in. But it is time for us to think that is it that those people are really irresponsible? What if that person forget affording the meals, okay, cannot afford even a mask to wear? Why? How should we blame that person? So these are very strong concerns, and I feel very privileged that we have been able to institute this platform. Today we have very eminent speakers, but the beauty of this forum is going to be that it is not only going to be about the divergence of views, but a lot of experiences that are going to be coming to the forefront. And I'm sure that this will enrich the atmosphere. And I repeat, not only sensitize us, but it will also make us raise few questions that will be aiding future research. I would like to congratulate everybody, all the stakeholders who have been involved in this. I'm sure that Naitya and Kartikeya, who have been my partners this time, they are going to do an excellent job. And I would like to extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Manjula and Dr. Anup Tripathi. Anup Tripathi, because he's been a very dear colleague, and Dr. Manjula has struck such a fantastic rapport with her in these few seconds that we have interacted with. A very warm welcome from the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, ma'am and sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your words of wisdom, Sonam ma'am. I would like to now begin this event. Rabindranath Tagore once said, "Faith is the bird that feels the light when the dawn is still dark." These words specially touch our hearts and speak to our souls during these times. If there is one thing that the pandemic has taught us, is that in the face of physical havoc, your mental well-being is primary. With a longer string of digits on the death toll, more hanging garlands round photo frames, and a devastating existential threat looming over all our heads, I would request all of you to keep in mind all the relatives, friends, healthcare workers, countrymen, and fellow humans who have lost their battle with the virus. Today, we are the privileged lot who sit in our homes safe and sound, while a section of our society wakes up every morning to fight a new battle, a battle to survive. Today, when the world is amidst a medical crisis and the healthcare infrastructure of this country is on the decline, it is imperative that we speak for the people who often get neglected in the class race. Therefore, the Debate Club, in collaboration with the Exchange and academic platform Jain deemed to be University, Block 2, Jayanagar, Bangalore, brings to you this much important discussion on the socio-economic effect of COVID-19 on poverty. We sincerely hope that today's thought-provoking session evokes a sense of empathy in each and every one of you. I would also like to take this opportunity to welcome our eminent speakers for the day, Dr. Manjula and Dr. Anup Tripathi. Thank you so much for being with us here today. I would now like to invite Kartikeya to please introduce Dr. Manjula.
Thank you very much, Naitya and Sonam ma'am, for that introduction. For the first speaker today, I'd like to introduce Dr. Manjula, who is the faculty at the School of Development at Azim Premji University, Bangalore. She holds a PhD in Agricultural Economics, and before joining APU, she was with the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, or MSSRF, where she has been working on ecological, social, and economic concerns of rural livelihoods. Her specific research interests are in the field of sustainable production systems, in natural resource management, ecology, and the political economy of resource access. She's also a practitioner working in the interface of gender and agriculture. She has been instrumental in implementing several programs aimed at strengthening livelihoods of resource-poor rural women across diverse agroecologies. She has several peer-reviewed journal publications, book chapters, and popular articles to her credit.
Thank you, Karthi, for that introduction. Thank you very much, the Debate Club and the Exchange Program of the School of Humanities of Jain University for having me part of this wonderful, initiative. And it's such a pleasure to see so many students online. Even in my online classes, it's like, it's very nice even if I get to see 50% of my students online, because most of them are going through one or the other personal struggle. So they just send me a mail saying that, ma'am, I can't log in today, I'll log in some other day. So it's great to see so many students logged in. So this is how I've planned the talk. I'll be, giving a snapshot of the very recent publication that has come out from the Azim Premji University, which is the State of the Working India report. This is the third in the series. And this year, the focus is on 1 year of COVID-19. So it gives you a complete snapshot of what happened during this 1 year in terms of poverty, job losses, food security, and a lot of things. It will be a very nice report if you can access and read it. It is freely downloadable and usable. From there, I will move on to the impact of the pandemic on agriculture. How has agriculture as a sector fared during the COVID period, during the lockdown period? And I will be touching upon the production and marketing aspects. The impact that the reverse migration of the informal labor sector has had on the agriculture economy, the impact it has had on the women farmers, and also we will look at some of the sectoral performance and whether these macro indicators really translates into terms of welfare of the farmers, the people who are really working on the field. And we look at critically look at how agriculture has fared under the Atmanirbhar program, look at the farm loss if time permits, and also look, touch upon strategies to improve the smallholder bargaining capacity. This is just a snapshot, as I said, what the State of Working India report says. And this is a report which has been compiled using a combination of secondary and primary databases. They've used the CMIE, Consumer Pyramid Household Survey, and then they have used also the Indian Working Class Survey, and also some of the phone interviews which the Azim Premji University had done to assess the loss of livelihoods during the lockdown in the last surge, or so to say. And this is a compilation of all that. This is what has come out by compiling all these resources. So in terms of job loss, it is very evident that there has been a lot of job losses, and there has been increased informality in the labor force. Nearly half of the formal salaried workers have moved into informal work, and the labor share of the GDP has fell drastically by 5 percentage points in the quarter 2 of 2020. And poverty also, there has been a fall, average of 17% fall in the monthly earnings of the workers during the pandemic, and the monthly per capita income even in October 2020 is still below the levels in January 2020. And the impact, as we all know by now, has been disproportionate across social categories, across gender. So women have been more suffering, have been more impacted than men, as the data also tells us. 61% of the working men have remained employed, but among the women, it's only 19% who has managed to remain employed during the pandemic, and 47% has suffered a permanent job loss. This is to say, because women has had very low fallback options. There was very low fallback options for women and socially marginalized, especially when there is a ill person at home, when there is somebody needs care. It is a woman who has to give up the job and be there, and because of this, all this social norms and the gendered norms which prescribe certain kind of gender roles to the women. And sufficiency of the government programs, we see that the PDS coverage has been much better than the Jan-Dhan program. Here again, the migrants have not been able to access the rations as much as the non-migrants. MGNREG has been very vital as a safety net program, and the states, still there are unmet demands for the MGNREG work. And each of the state has experimented with many policies at their own level to even to counter or alleviate some of the distress associated with the crisis. Like for example, Kerala has run this decentralized kitchen. There was this additional kit which was going through the ration shops, which was in addition to whatever was monthly takeaways from the PDS ration shops. And there are states which has given some additional provisioning in ration, and there are states which has done some topping up of fiscal stimulus. This is just to give you a little bit of an overview of what the State of the Working India report contains, and it will be a useful source of information for anybody who's interested to find out how has the states, or at the national level and across states, how India has fared in terms of coping with the pandemic and the lockdown, and what has the kind of impact it has had across social classes, across gender, and across regions. So from there, we will move on to the core of the presentation, which is agriculture and the pandemic. We'll look at how the sector fared during the pandemic period. Why do we need to look at? Because agriculture is the source of livelihood. This is all, things which you might know. It's a source of livelihood for 58% of the country's population, especially the rural population, and 44% of the country's workforce is employed in agriculture. So whatever happens in the sector will have a huge multiplier effect across the other sectors too. And it has a huge impact on the already impoverished, rural hinterlands of the country, because it's largely the rural people who are dependent on agriculture. In the pre-pandemic period, that is the Rabi sowing season, which starts from November and extends till March, the Rabi sowing season had really started off on a very nice footing. It was like the whole agriculture sector was upbeat because we had a prediction of, a northeast monsoon rainfall, which was 10% more than the normal season. And most of our reservoirs were full at 67% live storage capacity, and the MSP has been announced, and it was on the model which was declared during the Union Budget of 2018, which is like MSP in 1.5% of the average weighted cost of production. So the MSP, there has been an absolute revision in the MSP for different Rabi crops, and the range was from 85 to 325. And the percentage return over cost also ranges from 50 to 109%. So we had everything going in that sense for the sector before the pandemic. So the sector was quite upbeat, and we were looking forward for a bumper Rabi crop, which was also evident in the kinds of acreage or the advanced estimates that has come in terms of Rabi sowing. We have seen that the wheat, one of the major Rabi crops, the percentage change in estimates was 5.9%. So this year it was 5.9% more than the last season, the same season the last year. So total food grain production was predicted to go up to 552, which was 5.4% higher than the 2018 year. And then comes the lockdown, which was declared in 25th of March. That was a time when the harvesting season was starting, when the Rabi harvesting season ideally starts. It starts from the beginning of March and extends till June to mid-July, the harvesting and the marketing season. So that's when this whole the country went into this lockdown mode. So what it implied was this labor shortage. There was this exodus. We saw the exodus of the migrant laborers, and there was a complete supply chain breakdown because of the stoppage of transportation. And the impact of the supply chain breakdown was much higher than the labor shortage in agriculture. So how did it impact on harvesting? Though, given the fact that there has been, agriculture was exempted from the lockdown. I'll come to that later, what happened even despite exemption. Why did the sector fare badly in terms of, having those logistics being arranged during the harvesting time? So as I said, the country was expecting a bumper Rabi produce, and the wheat harvesting had already begun. Because how the wheat harvesting happens is in the country is, it starts from the central and eastern India and moves towards the north and the northwestern India. So your tractors, the combined harvesters, the laborers, all would move from the west to central India, eastern India, and then slowly move back to north and northwestern India by end of April or May, the beginning of the May. That is the usual pattern of harvesting that happens during the Rabi. So when the lockdown happened, the harvesters, the combined harvesters, the laborers, all were concentrated in the central and eastern India. And most of the harvesters were owned by the farmers of the Punjab region. Most of these are owned by them. And the mechanics, even if some of the harvesters were owned by people in the central and eastern India, the drivers for this combined harvesters, the mechanics for the combined harvesters, all used to come from the Punjab-Haryana belt. So when the country went into the lockdown, the movement of the combined harvesters halted. And the crop was ready to be harvested. It was waiting, and they were struggling to get harvesters. And also the farm labor. agriculture depends on the seasonal migrants, the seasonal migration, the short duration migrants, which is like people who migrate from rural to rural for a period of not less than 1 month and more than 1 month and less than 6 months. Those kind of seasonal migration which happens from the rural to rural region. These are the kind of farm labor who engage in harvest during the Rabi harvesting season. And these people also, there was this distress reverse migration that was happening, and people who wanted to move to these regions were not able to move because of these restrictions and mobility restrictions. And the large farmers somehow managed to tide over it. They somehow managed to retain their laborers by paying higher prices and also, using other resources. But the small farmers really suffered, and many of them had huge crop losses. This was despite, as I said, an exemption being offered to agriculture sector, and then a central policy guideline was there. This was mainly because there was a huge gap in the translation of the central policy guidelines into ground level implementation and operational guidelines. So there was a policy. The state had to really communicate this to the last line officials or whoever was in charge of controlling this movement of labor and machineries, the logistics support. So this, unless they had a paper in hand, they wouldn't go ahead and allow them to go. So there was a huge gap in this translation, and that led to a lot of loss in the Rabi harvest. And this is reflected in the kind of market arrivals that happened during that period. You can see that when you look at the market arrivals, even for wheat, it was, the arrivals in 2020 was only 55% of the amount that came in 2019. The crop which was affected most was the perishables, the fruits and vegetables, which had no shelf life, and also milk suffered because all the tea shops, everything was closed and no local sale was possible. And fruits and vegetables recorded 1/3 decline in market arrivals, and there was heavy loss for whoever was taking these fruits and vegetables. And there was a lot of distress sale happening locally and very poor price realization. And the price was not even meeting the harvesting cost. So many of the farmers went ahead and just plowed back their produce instead of harvesting. They thought that why should we incur this harvesting cost when we are even not going to realize even this harvesting cost, forget about the production cost. So they kind of went ahead and plowed back the produce into the field. That was a level of distress that was being experienced. So this macro data and macro data on production arrivals is all reflective of what comes from the field too. This I am basing on a assessment done by the RRCR study, which is a Rapid Rural Community Response to COVID-19, which was done in 13 states spread across 68 districts and 118 blocks. And whatever we have seen there reflects in the primary study also, wherein 55% of the respondents said that no Rabi procurement was possible because the logistics was poor, and no sale to the government agency was possible. Many of them were not aware of MSP, and not many got realized MSP. So there was this was really, the macro indicators were really reflective of what was happening in the field. So moving on to the Kharif sowing and the marketing season, which starts from June and moves towards September, October. The same logistics, though there was we were unlocking, there was some phase 1 unlocking, phase 2 unlocking, but still the seed companies they were still asked to operate at 50% capacity, because one was the labor was not able to move, and then second was they were asked to follow all the COVID protocols, which meant social distancing and all that stuff which comes with that, which meant they couldn't operate at full capacity. So there was a 25% decline in seed demand, and there were certification challenges. The companies couldn't certify their seeds, so they couldn't really sell their seeds, and most of the farmers depended on saved seeds which they had from the last season or through exchange seeds. And there was a lot of germination failures which was reported during the Kharif sowing season, and which led to a double burden, which meant that people had to re-sow, which meant additional cost in re-sowing and land preparation. And even when you look at crop loan disbursement, there was only 50% disbursement was possible, or the banks could do only 50% of the disbursement in most of the states. All this had implications in terms of in terms of coverage as well as marketing during the Kharif seasons. Though despite all these hardships, the Kharif sowing went about, and then there was an increase in the acreage under Kharif in the country. Again, the same kind of details come from the RCRC study, wherein they said, like, because of the poor Rabi marketing and harvesting season, the farming community was facing a huge liquidity crisis because they depend on the Rabi harvest and the returns from the Rabi crop to take the Kharif season. But then there was no money in the hand, they were not getting paid on time, whoever managed to sell their produce. So how were they coping with the liquidity crisis? Most of them were taking credit at higher interest rate from money lenders. Most of them were selling livestock, some of them were reducing the area under Kharif, and some were pawning their assets too. And input management, as I said, the credit disbursement was very poor. The seed, people were not able to buy seeds in the open market, and they depended on saved seeds, which had implications for germination and also implications in terms of costing for the farmers. Most of the farmers, almost 49%, reported that they had no means to have access to any kind of fertilizers. So this is how the Kharif season went about. But Kharif procurement data shows that it has gone up by 23% for paddy, which is one of the major Kharif crop in this 2020 marketing season compared to the previous year. And the MSP, and this is how it looks for the other crops too. So migration and agriculture. So what does this reverse migration have? What does it mean for agriculture? So the country has around 450 million internal migrant laborers, and that map, which is produced by Ajivika, tells you the pattern of migration, how they move from. You can see that mostly it's from the eastern belt, people are moving towards the western belt, and most of the seasonal migration, as I said, the short-term migrants happen during is in consonance with the peak agriculture season. People migrate from eastern belt to the western belt when the crops are ready to be harvested. They harvest these crops and come back to their source states. So it is mostly rural to rural migration, and most of the migrants are from very poor farming households, like small farmers or marginal farmers, or they are landless agricultural laborers in the central and eastern belt. And this seasonal migration was a means of buffering their income sources. This was an additional income that they could earn, and that had a lot of that contributed to improving the household income. And most of the source state, as you can see from us, UP, Bihar, West Bengal, Odisha, MP, and Jammu and Kashmir. And these all had very underdeveloped non-farm sectors, so they had no other options of being employed. They had to undertake this migration to this fertile farming belt of the western and the northwestern region. So when that couldn't be, that was not an option at all. That was not an option no more, because thanks to the lockdown and the pandemic, what is the kind of implication it had for the rural economy of the source states? There was a huge shift in the demographics, which meant that there was more mouth to feed, more hunger, more poverty, and food insecurity, and there was a huge surplus labor, which naturally pushed down the wage rates in that region. And whatever in terms of income they were earning through wage labor went down further, and the remittance completely stopped because they were no longer going in search of work. And this is an NSSO estimate which says that the internal out migrants, the amount of remittance that comes from the internal out migration, and the lion's share of the out migrant, this internal remittance comes from rural areas. And of this, the domestic remittance, more than 50% of the domestic remittance, the states of UP, Bihar, Rajasthan, West Bengal, the states from which the seasonal migrants go, these are the states which accounted for more than 50% of the domestic remittance. And what was this remittance being used for? It was mostly being used for, buffering this household consumer expenditure in the rural areas. So this stopped. It was, accounting for 41% of the household consumer expenditure. So when that, support system fails, then that leads to more hunger and poverty. And then you have this added burden of lowering of wage rate in your own region. And so totally the farmers, the household income went down drastically, and it had huge implications for food and livelihood security, and also in deepening the agrarian crisis, because there was no money to invest in improving the land or the soil, or investing in irrigation or anything. So the immediate concerns for the food and livelihood security, and deepening of the agrarian crisis in a belt which already is reeling under heavy agrarian crisis. What is the kind of impact it has had on women farmers? As we have seen, it has had differential impact across men and women in the country, and women farmers are no different, and they account for 75% of the farm work, and they own only 13% of the farmland, and they are not as officially recognized as farmers, which means that most of the entitlement that goes to the farmers or the schemes that goes to the farmers, they are not in a position to avail, because it is all linked to the property, it is all linked to the land, it's all land linked, including the PM Kisan payment. So harvesting and price realization, the conditions for the women farmers have been really bad, and most of them have not been able to harvest, and those who have harvested couldn't sell their produce, and those who sold couldn't sell it at MSP, they sold it to the local traders at a very low price, and most of them were engaging in vegetable cultivation, and most of the weekly markets had closed down, and this was an option for the women farmers to go and sell. If anybody is from the rural part of the country, you would have seen that all these weekly markets in the villages where all the women come and spat and sell the vegetables, all that was stopped, and this had huge implications for the earnings that women could have in the agriculture sector, the women farmers could have. And the reverse migration, the impact of the reverse migrations was much more on the women farmers, because I said there was surplus labor available, and which pushed down the wage rates. Already there was differential wage rates between men and women farmers, but the pushing down of the wage rates was much more for the women farmers. And the women also got displaced from the labor force, completely displaced, and even that job was taken by the men farmers. That was also reflected in the earlier data that I showed from the State of the Working India report. 45% did not get farm work, and even in the NREGA work, which was a huge safety net, only about 30% women had access to it. And even those women who got access to work, they were forced to work under very unsafe working conditions with no social distancing or any kind of protocol being followed. So they were exposed, they were very vulnerable and exposed to all this kind of vulnerabilities. And there was a striking change in the gender roles. Because what happens when the men out-migrate from the rural areas, as we have popularly seen, that feminization of agriculture, and women who hitherto have been unpaid family labor move on to the role of being decision makers. So when the men come back, they are again relegated to the role of being an unpaid family labor. They no longer have any decision-making power on how the land has to be sold, or in terms of how the income from the agriculture operations has to be sent, and so they get pushed back into their stereotypical gender roles. And most of them were also excluded from the safety nets for reasons that I have articulated earlier, because none of them had land in their name, and many of them did not have Jandan accounts, and so none of the the welfare measures that was being given through the Garib Kalyan Yojana, the women were able to access. There was this recommendation by the National Commission for Women for reframing policies and extending credit and other welfare measures without the collateral being attached to it. But that just got fizzled out, and it was not taken up much. So the women, as we can see in general, and the women farmers in specific had a lot to lose during the pandemic than the men in the sector. So sectoral impact, so it's just to show you that the GDP just didn't fall just during the pandemic, because it went into the negative contraction during the pandemic, but we already were in a very bad shape even before the pandemic. The years which you can see, like 18, 19 and 19, 20, we have been having lower GDP growth, and the growth has not great. And when you look at the episodes of slowdown, the period between 2017-18 to 2019-20, the total number of quarters of slowdown has been 10. So even before the pandemic had set in, and the lockdown and the subsequent loss in livelihoods and the impact on economy, the economy was already in a very bad shape. And added to it was the pandemic and the lockdown and the additional impact. So when we look at this is how the GDP and the GVF fared, there was a tremendous contraction in the Q1 over the previous period. But then, as is popularly said in the economic survey and in all of these government forums, we did see a V-shaped recovery. But let's look at how the sectors fared. This is a percentage change over the previous quarter of the quarters in the previous year. You can see that the figures in red, these are the only ones which showed positive growth compared to the same period in the last year. So you can see that agriculture consistently showed a positive growth in the estimate of GVA. And manufacturing picked up in the second quarter, but it again fell down in the third quarter. So this is to say that the sector as such, because of a good Rabi and Kharif season, good sowing, increase in acreage, and then the sector as such performed better. And then the government had come in with a lot of soaps in terms of exempting the sector from the lockdown. Though we have seen that it still had a lot of implication for the small and the marginal farmers. But even this performance that the sector showed didn't really translate into income in terms of the farmers, because even if you produce a lot and there is a lot of things being generated, there should be demand for it. The demand in general had fallen across. There's a recession-like situation. There was a recession, and there was a per capita income fall, contraction, which you can see in the table, 9.1 at constant prices, and you can see the private final consumer expenditure and the gross fixed capital formation, how it has contracted or reduced across the quarter compared to the same period last year, like 2019-20. So all this had implication in terms of demand being generated in the economy, and also kind of investments and savings happening in the economy, which had a huge implication for the welfare of the farmers in terms of realizing income from farming. This is just a trade-off, just to show you the trade-off between the lives and livelihood dilemma when there was a lockdown. This is all taken from the economic survey. So we were facing a twin shock of both the demand side shock and the supply shock, with the logistics and supply chain breaking down and demand going down because of the loss of jobs, reduction in income, and also because of the lockdown and the subsequent impact on the economy. This is a kind of response that the nation came up with, the state came up with to counter this economic slowdown and to bring in this fiscal stimulus. We had a total package of 20 lakh crores, of which 1.73 lakh crores was focused on agriculture. It was part of the tranche 3, and there were a lot of schemes which have been announced under Atmanirbhar. This is just a classification of these schemes based on the nature of the scheme, and also whether they were a new scheme which was introduced to address as a coping mechanism to counter this huge slowdown and to help the farmers and the sector, or was it a revision or a contingency change in the existing scheme. So PM Kisan was an already existing scheme. What they did was only the front loading thing, which was like an advance payment of the 2,000 rupees. And there was a lot of schemes which was aimed at direct support to farmers and rural economy, like the loan moratorium which was announced, interest subvention announced, MSP purchases, crop insurance was made optional, and there was a lot of disbursement which happened during the crop insurance. It was speeded up and there was a lot of disbursement happening. There was additional Kisan credit cards which were issued. There was additional refinancing support going, and MGNREGA was extended to support agriculture even during the peak agriculture season. It is usually given during off season, but here it was also given during peak agriculture season. And when you look at it, when I just run through all of this, most of them are either revisions or contingency changes in the already existing schemes. Like even these kind of things, vocal for local, top to total, and many of them were, could be classified as long run and strategic interventions, and of the short run responses, only the PM Kisan and to some extent the loan moratorium, which kind of, injected some kind of a fiscal stimulus or put cash in the hands of not even the loan moratorium, which is just the PM Kisan, which had put cash in the hands of the farmers. That was the need of the hour. You needed money in your hand to engage in your agriculture operation, to market, to trade, and even to, for regular consumption expenditure. So this was the only scheme which was there, which was addressing this. And all the rest of the schemes were like strategic plans, long-term plans, which was not going to help the sector come out of the impact of the COVID, or the farmers to come out of the impact of the COVID in the short or the medium run. It was all long run strategic interventions. I think I'll stop with that, because the rest of the things I have is the farm laws and take on the farm laws from a smallholder perspective, and the case of Punjab, and what are ways to improve the bargaining capacity of smallholders. So that I'll decide depending on how you feel about it. I'll just stop here. Sonam, I thought I'll stop with what happened with the sector, and also looking at the reform packages, the so-called reform package, the Atmanirbhar package, and whether it was even effective in having any kind of revival of the sector in the short run. The farm laws and the critique associated with it, or the take associated with it, is something which we can just leave it, or I can take it as part of the discussion.
I have one, not a sort of question, but it becomes, in the pandemic now, it's a question, like you said, of do we give money or do we give jobs and some, because right now, like if we look at the PM Yojana scheme, like you said, where they give money, where there's actual physical money being given to the farmers, in a way right now that's more important, because Manrega was very useful for a long part of the COVID pandemic, because it kept employment floating, and in a way it still kept the economy sort of running. But the question also comes up, do we widen the base of Manrega, or do we lengthen Manrega? Because I think they cut it short also recently. They cut, I think, from 90 days to like a month or something like that, which became a situation of, are they trying to widen the base by giving less sort of time to work, or are they just focusing on industries which need it the most? Like agricultural is the highest employer in Manrega, where they usually do a lot of things that tend to be forgotten. And Manrega wasn't really covered a lot during the pandemic. Everyone was arguing for a universal basic income. So do we look at fiscal policy as the only way, or do we have to now go back to supply side policies of saying, no, we need better machinery, we need better technology and all that stuff?
Yes, see, there is no either or, but it's all about timing it out. When there is a disaster, when there is a pandemic and there is a immediate disaster or recession at hand, the first step should be to stimulate the economy, stimulate demand. So that needs a more cash and direct benefit transfer kind of approach. Put cash in the hands of the people so that there is a demand picking up in the economy. And then you have to think about short run and long run plans. Short run plans would be like diverting Manrega, which was not hitherto given for, it was mostly implemented during off seasons in the rural areas. But then they modified and tweaked it and said, no, it can be even during the rainy season. You can use Manrega work for these kind of agriculture activities. Only very few states were allowing Manrega to be used for agricultural activities. So that was one way. And then there is a technological, even the governance reforms, the market reforms. This was long overdue in some sense, but the way it is being done and the kind of confusions that exist around it, that's a different story. We can take it if we really want to. But those are the kind of reforms which is already in the paper. It's not like it suddenly came up during pandemic and it was introduced. There has been so many committees, there has been so many attempts at reforming markets, agriculture markets, because this was one challenge area in the whole agriculture value chain, where the APMC market was suffering under a lot of, there was a lot of issues with the APMC market in terms of, cartelization, in terms of, the traders controlling the market fees, and the bottlenecks, the marketing bottlenecks, and most of the smallholders or the marginal farmers were not able to access the APMC mandis. There were a lot of structural issues with that had to be addressed. But it is not something which is not going to give an immediate relief to the crisis, right? It's a long run, it will only have a long run impact. The more you reform, but also the way you reform also has implications. But I wouldn't say like, pick either this or that, but I would only say that you face it out. But what is immediately required in a crisis is an immediate fiscal stimulus of putting cash in hand, putting food in the mouth of the people who are starving, and giving whatever kind of material humanitarian support that is required, and then move into structural things, like then provide job, then move into more addressing structural issues. So I wouldn't go for an either or answer. It is, we need all of them, but you need to face it out in a certain manner. Women, there's a question in the chat. What can the government do to help women who lost their jobs in the pandemic? One thing could be like the MGNREGA. They could extend that because when there is no other option left, that the men, the able-bodied, the men take up MGNREGA work. When you traditionally look at it, MGNREGA work is largely taken up by the women and the older generations. So when there is options of men getting back into other things, the women will have much more opportunity in accessing MGNREGA. So extending MGNREGA and continuing with that extension of MGNREGA will really have a impact on getting women back to the workforce. And also, there's a lot being done in terms of collectivizing and collectivizing the women farmers, and also the women in general, the SSG movements, the producer collectives. All these are also steps that could be done.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your valuable insights. We will now move on and I would like to take this opportunity to invite our next speaker for the day, Dr. Anoop Tripathi. Dr. Anoop Tripathi is a professor of sociology and environmental studies at Flame University, Pune. His areas of interest in research are homelessness, urban studies, and environmental impact assessment, or EIA. His ongoing project is titled Studying Walkability in Smart Cities and Housing and as Infrastructure of Care. Some of his publications are Legislation, Resources and Rights, a case study of forest rights in India, Human Geography and Environment Research, Uneven Development and Weak Governance in a Powerloom Hump, a case study of Solapur, Revisiting Homelessness, a case for chronicling voices from below in the book titled Research for Social Work in India, and his forthcoming publication is titled Smart Streets and Smart Cities, a case study for Pune's ITI Road and Jacob first-year Sustainable Cities and Communities. His achievements include Vision India Fellowship awarded to attend the World Governance Expedition in Singapore in 2019, Junior Research Fellowship in Social Work awarded by the National University Grants Commission India in 2012, and Qualified National Eligibility Test, the NET examination conducted by UGC in 2012 and 2017. He was granted a fellowship by the Ministry of Education, Czech Republic, for studying a semester at the Masaryk University, Brno, Czech Republic in 2011, and the National Talent Search Examination Scholarship awarded by NCERT in 2002. I would like Dr. Anoop to take over right now. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, Professor Sonam, Nitya, and Kartikeya. And thank you so much, Manjula ma'am, for actually, laying down the groundwork for me. So she has already very beautifully delineated the socio-economic impact of COVID-19 on vulnerable and marginalized populations, particularly in the rural areas. So the presentation that I have titled it as Pandemic and Poverty, Some Reflections, and some of it is based on a previous article that I had written. So the presentation structure is like there will be introduction, and then I want to talk about, very briefly, I will just touch upon neoliberalism and public good, and what kind of importance now they have with respect to COVID-19 pandemic in a pandemic situation, what it is doing to us. Then I'll be talking about urban poor and COVID-19, what kind of impact COVID-19 has had on urban poor and what has been the response so far. Then, because we are experiencing the second wave of COVID, so I'll be talking about that, and then how are we responding to the second wave, and then finally what we must do in order to overcome on this challenge that we are facing, all of us. Again, before I begin, I just want to say that particularly this time, it's emotionally exhausting time for us, for all of us, because I'm sure that even in this gathering, I'm sorry, even in this gathering, most of us, we have some relative or some acquaintance who's probably suffering from COVID. So this is the scale and extent to which, COVID-19 pandemic has been causing havoc in the country. And I would like to invoke what Albert Camus had written in his very famous novel called The Plague in 1942. And he had mentioned that empathy is the key. It is the way to fight pandemic. It's not heroism that is required. You don't have to be a hero, but you should just have empathy and common sense and decency in order to fight the pandemic. And unfortunately, what is happening in the past 2 years, that so far, past 1.5 years, what we are seeing is that most of the times in many of our policy decisions, many types of implementations that we have done, they were hasty and somewhere they were devoid of empathy. At the same time, we have to also understand that the multidimensional nature of poverty in India, I think Manjula ma'am has beautifully brought it out. It's also about the caste system that we have, because of which we are not able to have, empathy for everyone, but rather we tend to be in our own cocoons. We want to be in our own balloons of prosperity or islands of prosperity, rather than having an empathetic approach for pan-Indian level or for the entire humanity that is there in the world. Similarly, gender is another dimension of poverty, ethnicity, and even religion is also responsible for some of the poverty that we have. It is one of the structural causes of poverty. So what we need to do is to focus on urban poverty. So what I'm going to do in this presentation, in fact, is focusing on urban poverty, urban poor, and what has been the impact of pandemic. Much of it has already been discussed, but from an interventionist point of view, what can be done now so that this does not go out of hands, although it has already gone out of hands in certain sectors, certain respects, in many places, but still what all we can do in order to contain it. And one of the reasons why we have arrived, how we have arrived where we are today. In fact, there are two factors that why we are finding ourselves in such a tough situation. Is because, first of all, we have been pursuing aggressive neoliberalism for the past 30-40 years, particularly in the post-liberalization period. That is one thing. And the second is that over a period of time, particularly the middle classes and the rich classes in India, especially in the post-liberalization period, we have developed blatant disregard for public good. And that is why we are seeing that many of the things that could have been probably curable, many of the things that could have probably been contained, they have gone so out of hand. So let's very briefly discuss neoliberalism and the idea of public good. So neoliberalism, as you all know, it is essentially state withdrawing from essential services, and then you have the private sector that fills the gap, which is exactly what we are seeing, say, in the context of healthcare. So it's state which is mostly in the primary healthcare. So you have government hospitals where for primary healthcare, the poor people can go, because rich people, or even the middle class people, they consult private doctors in their clinics. And for secondary and tertiary healthcare, where you require hospitalization or where you have lifestyle diseases, they are to be treated by private hospitals. You also have the concept of 5-star hospitals these days. So this is the model that we developed, that we have developed in the last 30 or 40 years. But now what we are realizing, and in doing so, when we are developing this kind of a model of healthcare, so state is relegated to the role of a mere facilitator. So it's state's jobs to probably come up with regulations, and many of the things are also pushed into the domain of self-regulation. So the big pharma or the healthcare agencies or the big hospitals, they are left to self-regulate and come up with their own standardizations. But what we are seeing very interestingly these days is severe lack of oxygen. Okay, so there is oxygen shortages. There is a severe lack of, say, ICU beds or even ventilators that we are facing in the country. And one of the reasons is that most of the private hospitals, although they are mandated by law to have oxygen concentrators, to have oxygen plants, but most of the big, even 5-star hospitals, they have not been able to have an oxygen plant in their facility. And that is one reason why we are facing the oxygen crunch. Of course, there are many other reasons, but this is one reason why we are facing such oxygen crunch in the hospitals. And because of that, so many people have died, and all these deaths were preventable. As I said before, we have the secondary and tertiary healthcare, which has completely gone into the domain of the private sector. And secondly, even education and housing, they became commodities with full backing of aspiring middle classes. So it was the aspiring middle classes which was looking at the Western countries, which was competing with the Western countries, people in the IT sector, people who are MBAs, people who are IITs, the rising middle class, the rising new India. They were the ones who developed, who started treating secondary and tertiary healthcare, education, and housing as commodities rather than seeing them as social good. Now, another problem, and that is very important from sociological point of view, is that when this rampant neoliberalism was panning out in India, what it did was to also attack the kind of social solidarities we have. So many traditional caregiving arrangements fell apart in this period. And what became more important for the people, for this aspiring middle class or the rich classes of the country, is that it's more important to protect one's caste and class privilege. And now you could do that very easily because now you have gated colonies, now you have swanky apartments, you have private townships, you have private healthcare, you have private schools. So what it creates is islands of prosperity in the midst of poverty. And then it also, you also develop blinkers, so you are not able to see the rampant poverty that is outside your gated community, that is outside your islands of prosperity. And this in turn also breaks apart any kind of social solidarity that is possible. So we talk ourselves as proud Indians, but what does being a proud Indian mean? Does it mean to simply hold on to one's caste and class privilege, or do you actually empathize with the most vulnerable, with the most marginalized, with the most poor sections of the society in the country? So unfortunately, this emphasis on competency, this emphasis on meritocracy is also responsible for breaking up of social solidarity that we could have developed. So what is important to realize is that healthcare, housing, and education, they are public goods, and they are not commodities which has to be exclusively sold by bought and sold in the market. It is not something that has to be regulated by the market, but rather these three essential services should be looked at as essential services, and they must be seen as public goods. Now, looking at COVID-19 and what kind of impact it has had on the urban poor. So first of all, we need to understand who are the urban poor. So this is an invisibilized kind of population in our cities. Now, all of us, we have our domestic helps, we have security guards, we have our vegetable vendors, we have people who are working in the grocery shops, we have people who are working in restaurants, we have people who are working as our drivers, etc. And these people, they are severely underpaid workforce, because many of them are earning, say, 15,000 rupees or 20,000 rupees or even 25,000 rupees in a month. It is not sufficient to afford decent housing in any of the metropolitan cities in the country. Okay, because you cannot get even a slightly decent 1 BHK apartment on rent with that kind of salary. Okay, so we should be thankful to this section of the population, because even though they are severely underpaid, they are the ones who are keeping our cities running. Because of their labor, because of these laboring bodies, the engine of our cities is going on. And unfortunately, in the discourse, even in academia, but also in mainstream media, in politics, in economics, for our corporate honchos, and even for the middle classes, who also shape the discourses in the country quite a lot. I'm so sorry. So their housing, what kind of housing they are residing in. Are they residing in slums? Are they residing in inadequate housing? Are they able to afford housing, or or even when they are residing in say decent houses, are those houses really far away from the city? Are they spending too much time or money on travel, on commute from their homes to their workplaces? So this particular concern with respect to their housing, with respect to their healthcare, with respect to their citizenship entitlements are completely invisibilized. So it's not just their housing, but even their day-to-day concerns that are completely invisibilized. And of course, we also have the problem of unequitable access to services and amenities in the urban areas. So the posh neighborhoods, the middle class neighborhoods, they are serviced better. They get adequate water supply, they get proper sewerage facility, they get proper policing, they get proper street lighting, etc. But if you go to slum areas, if you go to poorer neighborhoods, they do not get such amenities, and even when they do, sometimes they have to pay more than what they otherwise would have been paying if it were a middle class neighborhood. That's one. The second problem is that it also has somehow creeped into the kind of urban planning we have been doing. So consider the example of Delhi, and Delhi as a city has been able to completely sanitize itself in early 2000s, particularly because of its preparation for the Commonwealth Games. So there are very few slums now in Delhi, and most of the poor people, they have been evicted and they have been thrown out of the city. Now we are in a situation that the master plan of Delhi, the current master plan of Delhi, has more space in terms of land area for parking lots than for housing for the urban poor. Okay, so the cars in Delhi, they have much more space for themselves than say the urban poor, are domestic helps, are drivers, are vegetable vendors, people who are working in shops, etc. So these people who provide essential and valuable services, people who keep our cities running, they get lesser space than cars in a city like Delhi. And you see a similar kind of thinking, similar kind of neoliberal thinking elsewhere. So where we have arrived because of this is that there is an absolute lack of support system for the urban poor, and it is not just institutional, but even the civil society has failed the urban poor up to a certain extent, because civil society, as Amita Bhaviskar has repeatedly pointed out, that or even Professor Sanjay Srivastava has been pointing out, that it has mostly been concerned with bourgeois environmentalism or middle class activism, which is not so much concerned with structural changes or with fighting poverty. In fact, I really like the argument of Professor Sanjay Srivastava, who says that the middle class, in fact, it is not so much of an economic or social category in India, but rather it is more of a moral category. So, we say that, oh, I'm a middle class person. So what you are implying is that I'm paying my taxes properly. I'm an honest person. So this is what you are implying. So this has less to do with your socioeconomic status, your socioeconomic class, and more to do with your assertion of it as a moral category. Now, what was the impact of lockdown, which was almost for 2.5 months to 3 months last year? I think it has been documented quite nicely by many organizations, including Azim Premji University, including Yuva, including Center for Policy Research, so TISS. There have been so many, IIHS in Bangalore. So there are so many places which have been able to nicely document the impact of lockdown, how mindless it was or how unplanned it was, and what kind of havoc it played into the lives of the urban poor. And we had these heart-wrenching scenes where people have been walking hundreds and thousands of kilometers to reach to their native places. But this should make us really concerned with what kind of cities or what kind of urban spaces have we created. So we have created urban spaces, where you have, posh neighborhoods, where you have your islands of prosperity and really swanky architecture. But such urban spaces couldn't even accommodate the migrant workers for even 2-3 months. So as a country, as people who take great pride in us being a great civilization, I think it should put us to shame that we cannot afford our laboring bodies, people who provide valuable services to the cities, people who actually keep the economic engine of the city going. We are not able to provide them, with relief for even a period of 2 to 3 months, providing them, say, with housing or, a ration, or limited economic help. So somewhere, again, from sociological point of view, I think, if you look at what George Simmel had said in his very famous essay, Metropolis and the Mental Life, about this blasé attitude, that how urban dwellers develop this blasé attitude. And what it means is this, the attitude of indifference. So we became so indifferent to the suffering and poverty around us. And this has been happening, for a very, very long time, particularly because of the ideology of neoliberalism, which wants us to function as separate islands and not have empathy with each other and not hold state and corporate sectors to account. So that's one. And another, another framework from which this kind of behavior can be looked at is the framework of calculative rationality, which Max Weber has talked about, that how we have become so rational, how we have become so calculative, that we fail to empathize with the population of our country, we fail to empathize with our immediate neighbors, and we are also not able to hold our government to account, to have policy decisions which are much more humane. So in a nutshell, what it tells us is that whatever urban planning we have been seeing in the country and whatever resources are being generated, and again, most of these resources are also being generated out of taxpayers' money and out of the banks that are giving loans. It's not just the FDI which is coming to the country, or because of which, we are seeing these kind of planning, or, we are seeing these kind of new spaces which are being built in our cities. So whatever urban planning and resources that we have, they are now or exclusively catering to the rich and the middle classes, creating such islands of prosperity, and very little thought has been given, to accommodate the concerns and also housing requirements of the urban poor. Now, another thing that I want to talk about and is the second wave of COVID. And one thing that I think by now, I think all of us need to realize is that, even though we had created such islands of prosperity and sanitized the spaces in the city, but these islands of prosperity and sanitized spaces cannot withstand zoonotic infections like COVID-19, because the virus does not have any regard for you, whether you are rich or poor or Hindu or Muslim or upper caste or lower caste. They simply the virus does not function like that. So even if you create gated communities, sanitized spaces, still zoonotic infections will come to haunt you. And what was happening during the second wave last year, and also during the lockdown, prior to lockdown, and even after the lockdown, was that I think by and large today we have a general consensus that India mishandled the first wave as well, particularly because of the severe lockdown. But because it was largely the poor people who were paying the price, so the middle classes and the rich didn't care. A lot of people died in the first wave itself. We had gut-wrenching scenes of poor people walking for hundreds and thousands of kilometers, and of course many good Samaritans, particularly the civil society activists, and many politicians also tried to help those people out. But at the same time, most of the middle class and rich people, even though we were seeing those scenes on our television sets, but we didn't care much for them. Why? Because it didn't hit us. Okay. But what is happening now because of the second wave is that it has shaken up the middle class and even the rich. And that is why now we are seeing so much of voicing on social media and even on mainstream media. Even people questioning the policy decisions of the government. People are now realizing that our healthcare is in shambles, how we did not plan adequately for the second wave, and so on. If second wave hadn't hit the rich classes and the middle classes, probably we wouldn't have been seeing this kind of discourse at least in the media. But I don't know whether fortunately or unfortunately, whatever is happening in the country right now, at least the middle classes and the rich people are not realizing that health infrastructure of the country is inadequate, and people are dying not because of COVID, because even many middle class people and rich people are also dying. And most of the people are dying not because of COVID infection, but because of lack of healthcare infrastructure. People are not getting oxygen cylinders on time. People are not able to get oxygen beds. People are not able to get ventilators. People are not able to get ICU facilities. People are not able to get, many medicines are absent in the market. People are not able to get certain injections and steroids. And because of that, we are seeing that, even the middle classes and rich people are now deeply perturbed by the second wave. So again, how we are responding to this kind of situation, and unfortunately, our response is, far from adequate. If you know Orhan Pamuk, the Nobel Prize winner in literature and very famous novelist, he has argued that people have always spread misinformation and rumors during pandemic, and unfortunately we are seeing so many WhatsApp forwards, so much of misinformation in social media, which is also unscientific, which also comes from an anti-science position. And unfortunately, a lot of people are also stoking communalism during the time of pandemic. So this is something that we should actively desist from, refrain from, and we should very strongly condemn, because this is not the time to spread rumors, misinformation, anti-science attitudes, anti-vaccine attitude. There are many influencers on social media who repeatedly have been spreading anti-vaccination attitudes. They are anti-vaxxers, as they are popularly called. And there are also people who are stoking communalism in such times. We must, so as youth of the country, you must condemn these kind of attempts to break up the social fabric of the country. Now, another thing that we are seeing is that even in terms of vaccination, even in terms of cure and providing, of course. Yes, of course. So I said that. So when I'm talking about people, I'm talking about everybody across the spectrum. Okay, how people have been spreading misinformation, communalism, and rumors during pandemic, and it is our responsibility to actually check this. At least as youths who are very, you guys are very well versed with social media. So at least the anti-vaxxers who have been spreading this kind of attitude on Instagram, on Facebook, at least those kind of people, we must respond to them. We must say that no, this is wrong to spread this kind of misinformation. Now, another thing that we are seeing in the country is with respect to the kind of medical care that is being given. So we see that there is still some discrimination. So in metropolitan cities, in big cities, you see people who are able to hold oxygen concentrators, who are able to, like in the case of Bangalore, we know that people were able to book their beds in advance, even though they had mild symptoms. You have many hospitals in which VIPs have booked the beds, and many common people are struggling to get beds or oxygen concentrators or even ICU beds or ventilators for themselves. We are also seeing, so there have been, again, this is not a verified information, so I do not want to put it, but then there are all news reports that are saying that vaccines are being taken to posh societies first and not being distributed to the vulnerable sections of the society or in the slum areas. Recently, Chhattisgarh government, it came up with a scheme to vaccinate the marginalized sections of the society first. But the Chhattisgarh High Court struck down this decision, and it said that no, you cannot provide vaccines to the vulnerable population first or the marginalized population first. We are also seeing that many Mumbaikars, many people who are in Mumbai, they are rushing to rural areas for vaccination because they are not able to get slots in Bombay. And we also know about the techies in Bangalore, where Jain University is situated, that how they are using scripts and tools to book slots. And because of that, many people who are not, not very well versed with technology, they are not able to get vaccine slots for themselves. So the problem is, again, what we need to understand, what all these people need to understand is that even if you immunize, say, about 1/3 of the population, and if you just want to, immunize people who are rich and the middle classes, say you want to immunize 20 crore people or 30 crore people, it's pointless. Why it is pointless is that because unless you vaccinate at least 70 to 80% of the population, and very quickly, what will happen is that the virus will mutate, okay? And then for new variants, we may require new vaccines. So the purpose is defeated. So what we need to do is that, vaccinate everyone as quickly as possible. Do not have this vaccine apartheid. So what is the major learning from here? Either we are all in this together or we are going to lose. You cannot just vaccinate 30% of the population and think that we have been able to, tide over the COVID crisis. No, it is going to hit you very hard because the virus will mutate and the new variants will come, and again, you will have to search for a new vaccine. So what we must do? First of all, we need to fight misinformation and quackery. Okay, that is rampant in social media, and many people, even in mainstream media, sometimes they spread misinformation. So we must challenge that. We must fight it out on social media or on these kind of spaces. Another very important thing, which is also mentioned in the directive principle of our state policy in the Constitution, and about which the first Prime Minister of the country, Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru, was really vocal about, which is imbibing scientific temper. We must imbibe scientific temper. We must get rid of superstitious attitudes. Now, a very famous primatologist, Jane Goodall, I'm sure you must have heard of her. So she says that it's empathy, which is the basic human value, which brings us closer to our highest potential. So as human beings, we can work to our highest potential only when we develop the attitude of empathy. We need to cultivate empathy in all of us. And Margaret Mead, again, a very famous social anthropologist, she was of the opinion that it's the empathy and care for fellow humans, which is the cornerstone of human civilization. And she basically went to an excavation site, an archaeological site in Mesopotamia, which was a 15,000 years old site. And there she saw somebody, like it was a skeleton, which had its femur bone broken, which is the thigh bone. So what is the hallmark of a civilization? Where somebody who needs care, where somebody whose femur bone was broken and it got healed. How was that possible? Only when other people were taking care of that person. So that is the hallmarks of civilization. That is from where the human civilization began, when we started caring for each other, when we started empathizing for each other. So what we also need is vaccine justice. We need quick and mass vaccination as soon as possible. And for that, maybe one of the approaches that we could think of is, again, the age-old approach of conducting health camps in every village and every city ward for COVID care and immunization. So we must organize health camps. We must include local stakeholders, public representatives, the people who are, maybe doctors and scientists or the prominent people of the area. And we must get everybody not just immunized, we must also provide them, information with regard to proper COVID care. So ultimately, we have to be in this together. We cannot merely operate from our islands of prosperity. So with this, I would like to conclude. Thank you very much. And in case you have any questions, I would be very happy to address them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your valuable insights. I do actually have a question for you. So you said one approach can be to conduct health camps for efficient vaccination, but we still see that even after 1.5 years of COVID, the rural population still chooses or still is unaware of the repercussions, and as a result, they are not acceptable to the vaccines. So, sir, what is your take on that? I mean, do you really think that just going and setting healthcare camps is going to lead to efficient vaccination? Because we often see that the people in the rural sectors are much more adamant. They are, and due to, again, lack of education or lack of exposure, they are much more hesitant to take on modern medicine and so what's your take on that, sir?
I would say that even people in urban areas have vaccine hesitancy. Okay, it's not just people in the rural areas that might be having vaccine hesitancy. Even many people in urban areas are having vaccine hesitancy. And why? Because most of them have misinformation, which is reaching to them through WhatsApp forwards or other social media platforms. So what we need is also celebrities, also politicians, influencers, disseminating correct information to people, okay, on television, on radio, on social media platforms. So all these celebrities, influencers, politicians, they need to come together and start mass education program like that, telling people that vaccines are absolutely safe, please take them, okay. But we are not seeing it coming from the government. We need our prime minister, we need our chief ministers to actually go to the television and say that vaccines are absolutely safe, please get vaccinated as quickly as possible, and here we are providing vaccines to you, right? Similarly, all the big actors, cricketers, all types of influencers, they need to go to their social media handles, they need to probably come on TV and give this message to the people. We also need doctors and scientists and academicians to do this work, okay. So I think some of the vaccine hesitancy might go away because of that. So that is what I'm saying. You cannot fight misinformation just like that. You also need to provide correct information to people. That is how you fight, misinformation and rumors, which is what we need to do. And then probably, if this is followed by, health camps and mass immunization camps, then probably, they will be really successful. And again, vaccine hesitancy is something that is not exclusive to rural areas. Even in urban areas, people are very much hesitant. You talk to your own relatives, you'll probably get a picture.
Thank you, sir. If there are any questions for both Dr. Anup and Manjula ma'am from the audience, we'll take it now.
I was just going to add to what Anup said, like, reflecting on what Amok pointed out. Also stop having this politics over vaccination, because, at some point you come out with all kinds of just opposing everything that the government do is not constructive opposition. Like, there are points at which we have to play the role of a constructive opposition. So that also leads to a lot of biases in the minds of the people. So it's not a government's vaccine or a anti-government vaccine or anything like that. Vaccine is a vaccine.
Yeah.
And ICMR system is ours.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when you are, dismissing the efficacy of it, when you are dismissing the protocols, everything, you're not dismissing this government of the day. You are dismissing the scientists and the doctors and the lot of professionals who have worked behind it. So that's also something which whoever be it.
And it's remarkable how quickly they have been able to come up with the vaccine. I think we should be thankful to our scientists that within a year they were able to come up with vaccines. This has never happened before in the history of humankind.
We didn't have the leisure. We didn't have the leisure to go through all the set protocols, because this was an immediate healthcare emergency and we needed it quickly. So it's like hats off for the different kinds of vaccines that has come out, the Russian, the US, whichever be the strain.
I'd like to move on to the anecdotes now from the students. I would again like to thank both of the speakers for informing us about all these various parts of the whole topic we were discussing. Now I'd like to call on the first speaker, Chirag, to talk about his anecdote.
Thank you, Kartikeya. So first, I'd like to talk about the positive impact of COVID on my life and my family. So what COVID has done to our family is brought us together. My father is a surgeon and he was always in the hospital and always on call. But as soon as COVID hit, as bad as it may be, he spent time with us, and I was very happy when he did that, because I didn't get much time with my father before, but now I did. And we also did a lot of activities together. We did gardening, and we also picked up a lot of activities which I could never do. So I picked up. I started reading again. I stopped reading books. I started reading again. Then I gardened for a while. Then I cleaned the house. I learned to wash the dishes. I learned cooking, and it actually brought the entire family together, as all of us did it together as a family, which makes me really happy. As well as connecting together with my friends and relatives who I had not met in a long time. I talked to them over the phone, and I talked to my school friends who I not met in a very long time. So COVID-19, as it may have been, it is a bane for others as well, but I saw it as a boon, as I got to do lots of stuff together with my family as well. It brought us together, and I learned a lot of life skills as well in this situation. Thank you very much.
Next, I'd like to call up Manvi to talk about her experience.
Thank you, Kartikeya. I'm here to share with you 3 different incidents that I came across, or I heard from a friend who is completely into social service through his organization Youth for Parivartan here in Bangalore. One of the most heart-wrenching thing was a case of the labor class or the migrant workers who were at Nimans, which was also a COVID center, which still is a COVID center. And during the lockdown, the constructions were put on hold, but inside the campus, there was several construction work going on inside, and these workers mainly hail from Gulbarga. And obviously, due to the complete shutdown, they found it difficult to get themselves food supply, groceries, and they had to buy all of them from the meager savings that they had, since they were not being paid for the work that was going on during the lockdown as well. And so they took up this initiative of coming together, and there were different buildings that were being constructed. So there were different families who came together to cook so that they could, save the resources that the other organizations or NGOs were providing them. And they also, the parents only ate the leftovers, and they all had only 2 meals a day, which means they skipped a single meal every day so that the rest of the family or the kids could eat and support themselves. So as even drinking water, grains, and gas, they were trying to save even drinking water. This was one of the incidents that I heard of. And the second one was again in Bangalore during November, there was a very high rate of rainfall that we experienced, and all the low-lying areas were flooded. Basically, there were small constructions that were completely flooded, and there was up to 5 feet of water. So people had to literally stay on their terraces. They lost everything, and they had to obviously maintain social distancing and all of that, which was not possible during that time. And there were so many snakes that they had to encounter, and food, and basically everything was gone. And there were again several organizations that came together to help these people obtain food and groceries so that they could sustain for like 5-6 days and then go on. And all of them mostly belonged to the working class, or some of them were government employees also who had salary cuts, and some of them were sitting idle at home. So basically for them, even going and buying groceries was very difficult because they were not able to afford it at that time. Even though they were working full-time and overtime, some of them were unable to sustain themselves. So I think there's so many such incidents that we have come across, and it's very overwhelming to see that, people are actually out there facing this, and also that there are so many youth who are involved in trying to help these people come out of this. And it was very, I don't know, I think it's a group of 15-20 teenagers who are all of my age, my classmates, who are doing this during these times and supporting them. Some of them are also working themselves, because now they're that 18, they can fund themselves. So they're working and then contributing their salaries to these families and taking and adopting some families like these, and also funding the education of some students who have lost their fathers due to the pandemic, and helping them study. So I think a lot of inspiration for all of us to take it forward. Thank you so much.
Next, I'd like to call upon Sheila to talk about her experience.
My name is Sheila Chitsinde and I'm from Zimbabwe. I'm an international student. And today I'm going to talk about the negative impact of COVID-19 in my country, Zimbabwe. The lockdown imposed to contain the spread of COVID-19 have dealt a severe blow on the poor communities in Zimbabwe, many of whom were daily wage earners living hand to mouth, who were unable to find work in cities. The ban on travel has meant that seasonal employment in rural areas is no longer an option. With work opportunities disappearing, the recent report states that 42% of urban households will not be able to meet their cereal requirements this year, compared to approximately 30% of the same period in 2019. I will give the example of a vendor. Due to many economic challenges in Zimbabwe, the employment rate has become really low over the past few years. Our country has a very high pass rate, and hundreds of students graduate each and every year from universities. But then after getting a degree, they cannot get a job anyway because the economy is bad. The economy is bad and the companies are not taking any employees. So many young men's only choice is to hustle, and some actually become vendors and start selling foodstuffs, clothes and phones in the street. But then when the lockdown was imposed and no one was allowed to move around or go to work, this led to many families who solely depended on vending to starve. And because everyone was at home and no one went to work, those who rented houses in suburbs could not afford paying rent. Thus the cost of living became high and the standards of living were very, very low. Another way the COVID-19 affected citizens was the massive deaths nationwide. Let's say the father of the house or the breadwinner dies of COVID-19, he or she would have to leave his or her family with no one taking care of them, and that is a very, very, very sad situation. Another way COVID-19 has affected Zimbabwean students, Zimbabwean citizens. We were also affected as students. I'll give an example of myself. I could not go to school. I got a scholarship in India. So, and then there was the COVID-19, and then there were lockdowns, and no one was allowed to move around or travel or leave the country. So now we have to stay at home and do online classes, and it's quite a pain because sometimes we have network problems here in Zimbabwe, or sometimes we have power problems, and it's a very difficult situation. So yeah, COVID-19 has severely affected Zimbabwean citizens in very, very negative ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheila, for the anecdote, especially from an international student's perspective. Finally, we have the last panelist, Akshaya. So please take it over.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Akshaya from BA Economics Honors. So where India is in the midst of dragging a second wave of COVID-19 and is recording over 3 lakh daily coronavirus infections. If we see how COVID-19 threatens people living in poverty or in India, we may never know the full answer. Where the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the world in many ways, of the several implications on humanity, the issues of health, the rapid decline of economy, shortage of medicines, sanitizers, masks, and other essential poverty and unemployment. Globally, but its impact on marginalized sectors, women and children has been immense in India. Lockdown has brought millions below the poverty line, struggling for basic needs like food and shelter, without access of safe water or toilets at home, and fear across the world, where the lack of security, money and health too, which then leads to unequal share in domestic responsibilities to violence against the vulnerable members of the household.
Thank you, Akshaya. And I want to thank the panelists once again for giving so many different perspectives and different anecdotes. Lastly, I'd like to call upon Nithya to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Kartikeya. I would like to extend the vote of thanks to Dr. Chandraj Roychand, Chancellor, Jain deemed to be University, for being a perennial source of strength in supporting us in our endeavors. I would then like to thank our eminent speakers for the day, Dr. Manjula and Dr. Anu, for taking out time from their busy schedules and being with us here today and sharing their insights on a very important topic. Dr. Sundarajan, Pro-Chancellor, Jain deemed to be University, Dr. Raj Singh, Vice-Chancellor, Jain deemed to be University, Dr. Ishwarajan Iyer, Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Director of Placement, Dr. N.V.H. Krishnan, Registrar, Professor Sridhar Murthy, Director of Academics and Planning, Ms. Aparna Prasad, Director, Office of Communications, and Dr. Sonam Mansukhani, Assistant Dean, School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Jain deemed to be University, Bangalore. I would also like to extend my heartfelt thank you to the Office of Communication, to Samana ma'am and Shisha ma'am for their constant support. Thank you so much for being with us here today. We look forward to more interactions with you.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you, sir. And Nithya, just a small correction that Dr. Aparna Prasad, she is also the chief mentor of our school. Okay, so we would like to thank her because it is her vision, and her purpose that we are trying to execute. So thank you so much to everybody for being here.